Well, hello there. Who are you?
This is the Zodiac speaking.
Killing must feel good to God, too. He does it all the time. And are we not created in his image?
We all go a little mad sometimes.
After all, murder is, or should be, an art.
I could kill you now pretty easily. Do some interesting things before anyone showed up.
What are these films you can't wait to look at?
Welcome to the Final Girls podcast and the 12th episode of our series dedicated to on-screen serial killers of horror film history. I'm your podcast host, Anna Bukatskaya, and in this episode, things are about to get real dark. I'm joined by Dr. Serka Nieline, who you might remember from past episodes such as A Nightmare on Elm Street and Dracula, to talk about the method and the madness of David Fincher's Seven. Few serial killer procedural horrors have had such a palpable impact as this one, from its title credit sequence to the overwrought display of the murder scenes, down to the nihilistic edgelord pseudo-philosophy of its serial killer John Doe, who carries out a series of elaborate murders inspired by the Seven Deadly Sins. On his tail are Detective Somerset, who was just hoping to retire, and his rash new partner, Detective Mills. Now, listeners, I am very aware that pretty much the entire lead cast of this film is a problematic mess. Rest assured, in this episode, we do not throw any flowers their way. And while this has undoubtedly stained my experience of the film, Seven is a seminal text when we're talking about serial killer movies, and the first of several Fincher films I'll be covering in this series. Expect to hear about Zodiac and Mindhunter in future episodes, and you can see what else we've covered and what we will be covering over the coming weeks over on the Final Girls Letterboxd. If you're hankering for more in-depth conversations about new horror releases, horror TV, and books, head over to our Patreon where you can find hours and hours of horror treats. All of this will be linked in the show notes, and if you're feeling particularly generous, leave us a review over on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And with all of that said, please enjoy our take on Seven. Serka, it's lovely to speak to you again. Always a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you, Hannah. That's fantastic. Been looking forward to this.
So, since it's the first time that we're recording in this series, I wanted to ask you, what comes to mind for you when you think of serial killers in the movies?
Ooh, that I'm perpetually fascinated by them. I don't know why, but they speak to me on a very visceral level, I guess. I've always been fascinated by the way that serial killing has been presented on screen as something that is a puzzle, that is a formula, that has a way of articulating a particular order in the world, and that it reflects and brings out chaos instead. So I've always thought about serial killer films as something particularly exciting, something I very much associate with my teenage years watching films, because there was this boom in the 1990s of serial killer cinema in particular. So it's also a limit experience. Some serial killer films you don't see that much, some others you see a lot. So I associate it with all those kinds of my burgeoning horror taste being refined in the 1990s, outside of my own particular fascination with monsters and vampires, but serial killers in particular being very much tied up with my teenage consumption of horror. So, but also recognizing those plots and formulas and how they got developed pretty much out of the 90s. Yeah,
it's really fascinating that a fascination with serial killers seems to be a very common rite of passage for burgeoning horror fans. And I'm glad you bring up the 90s and the boom of serial killer crime thrillers and horror films that came out during this time. Seven is arguably one of the best, if not the best examples of that. So can you set the scene for us? This film comes out in 1995.
Yeah.
Where is this up and coming serial killer genre? Kind of what are the key titles? What is it? How is it formulating itself?
Right, so I think before this, you had a couple of other titles. I mean, some including Brad Pitt, and for instance, that had a bit of a breakthrough in culture. The big one, obviously, being Silence of the Lambs from 1991, based on the 1988 novel, and that really set the tone. I think there's an interesting confluence going on in Hollywood culture at this time that really aids the development and the flourishing of the serial killer narrative, and that's around the Hollywood Gothic movement. So as I've written elsewhere, if you want to look into that, or anyone wants to read that stuff, I've written elsewhere about it. The Hollywood Gothic movement was this idea of making horror films for an adult audience, but based on literary material, so that they didn't feel they were watching something as grubby as horror, but something like serial killer stories and all that were brought into the psychological thriller domain. And this was a label that was much more comfortable in the video store, and something that your parents don't watch horror, but they watch psychological thrillers, etc.
Totally.
So this was something that was very, very common in the early 1990s. And there's a load of films that contain serial murder, essentially, but may not be given the strapline of serial killer narrative because it's considered, as I say, horror and therefore a bit grubby. All of this is to say that you have titles like Silence of the Lambs, which are described as psychological thrillers that have literary bases, in Dracula and Frankenstein, etc. But they are serial killer narratives as well, as much as anything else. So this is the big one, the stylish one, the one that wins the 5 Academy Awards. But it starts that trend where there's lots of adaptation of Gothic literature, but there's also a flourishing of serial killer stories. The ones that immediately come to mind from my misspent youth in the video store is California, which is one that isn't really seen that often.
California with a K.
California with a K, with David Duchovny and Brad Pitt and Juliette Lewis and Michelle Forbes. And that's one that I think, when you go look back at it, it had all the right numbers. It was very much paint by number serial killer story, but it worked quite well. And at the time, it felt very stylish and cool and interesting. But Seven comes along, and Seven blows so much of the competition out of the water because it's so stylish and so dark. Whereas the other ones you feel a little bit divorced from them, or you feel a little bit sort of, the narrative trajectory feels quite simple. Seven is actually quite grimy in a way that you feel implicated constantly within the story world. And that's something that I think shifts and changes the tone. Other films come around the same time as Seven. I'm thinking Copycat, for example, which is based on a lot of different serial killer tropes and types with Holly Hunter and Sigourney Weaver. And it kind of runs through the 90s in various B titles as well. But I still think of Seven as sort of like the grade A example of fantastic mid-90s serial killer stories. And it's also got the most stylish, I think, presentation since Silence of the Lambs.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that you bring up kind of the Hollywood Gothic movement. I rarely think of it as a movement, but I think a lot about the films that came out in the wake of Interview with the Vampire, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Bram Stoker's Dracula, Wolf, Mary Riley, which is an adaptation of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Movement.
Yeah,
That's
it pretty much is. Yeah. I
wrote
wrote a piece a few years ago about these this micro genre that emerged in the early 90s. And what's interesting about what you say is that both of these through lines, the serial killer narratives that were rebranded as psychological thrillers and the fancy period horror films that were coming out around the same time, they're all chasing prestige, just in opposite ways. So they're both very stylized and drawing from either classic literature or pulpy airport thrillers. Even Silence of the Lambs and Manhunter were based on the Thomas Harris bestsellers, which are exquisite but are very much mass market paperback thrillers.
Oh, yeah.
So before we get into, and I'm sure we'll get into the stylization of Seven, tell me a little bit about your own relationship with this film. When did you first watch it? And is it one of those films that you kept coming back to over and over again over the years?
Oh, God. Okay, so it's a confession time, Anna.
Hit me.
I snuck into Seven to see it. Yeah, I know. Terrible. I snuck into the films that have since defined my life in some ways. So I snuck in to see Seven with two friends who were not horror fans. who we kind of lied our way into the cinema to see it. And we were actually, just before the film started, they actually came up to us and said, "Are you sure you're 18?" It was like,
No
"Oh, yes,
way."
I'm sure." And the movie started, and I was just I was hardening up my horror cred at this time. But this was a hardcore film to really kind of encounter at age, I think I was 14. But watching this film, I remember when we get to Gluttony, which is the first murder,
Yeah.
I kind of thought, I think I've made a huge mistake. So I was starting to feel quite anxious, but my two other friends were really in pieces watching the film. So I have a very fond memory of I was toughening up for my horror taste to come watching this film. Since watching that, I remember coming back to a lot on DVD, and we had screenings of it in university and things like that. And I remember finding it as something that I really enjoyed watching, because there's a lovely structure and style to it. It's the seven murders, the seven kind of echoes of it. I thought that worked very well. But then the older I get, going back to rewatch it for this, but going back to rewatch it a few years ago as well, the older I get, the more grim the film becomes.
Yes.
What you can edit out in your teens and 20s is remarkable, because as you get older, the more you kind of see, actually, this is just grim. This is just, it's beautifully done, but it just makes you feel like the weight of the world comes upon your shoulders a little more the older you get watching it, in my opinion. So, but it's still a great film to return to, and it's an absolute masterpiece in terms of style as well. So yeah, I still appreciate it very much.
Oh, I still appreciate it and love it very much. It's interesting. It's one of those films that I remember discovering either on VHS, one of those kind of adult VHSs that was hidden away in my parents' one of the drawers somewhere. But at the same time, I remember revisiting it so many times, and I wonder what it was that I found so pleasing about it. Because similarly to you, when I rewatched it last night in preparation for this, I was very not put off. I was completely consumed by how dark and how black-hearted the film is.
Yes. Yeah.
And I remember when I was a teenager, I think the neatness of the structure, this very confined and very deliberate series of neat boxes that everything fits into. It's the 7 deadly sins. It's 7 days. It's 7 murders. It's all of these kind of, you're counting down to a big reveal. All of this plan that's put in place by John Doe, the serial killer at the heart of the movie, felt very, I think the sense of control felt really comforting in a strange way. But I wonder, what did you feel like revealed itself to you on this most recent watch?
Well, one thing I think I definitely, again, it comes back to what you overwrite or you allied over when you're younger watching it, was that I must have, either there was an edit in the version that was actually screened in Ireland in 1995 when it was released, but the scene when we see the Polaroid for the Lust murder, I don't remember taking in the size of the weapon in my mind. So going back to rewatch it a few years ago, it landed. Yeah. And then when I watched it 2 nights ago, you actually see the Polaroid twice. Yeah. And I remember thinking to myself, oh my God, that's turned my stomach in a way that it didn't 20 years ago. So I think, as I say, your brain has a way of either coping or writing out stuff that you don't either want to see or stuff that you can't cope with seeing. So that, and again, the fact that it's a murder, you don't see any of the murders, but in the sense that you, it's the one where the soundtrack in the space colors in your imagined horror of that murder. That's where I think it really landed with me very, very darkly the last time I watched it. So,
and what do you think is Seven's reputation?
I think it's seen as a artful film. I think it's seen as one that has very intellectual ideas at its core, which it does. It fits in very, again, with that 90s psychological framework, but also very much with that kind of literary framework, the references to Dante, the references to the Parsons Tale, etc. You're like, oh, okay, there is something high art here. There is some sort of early modern kind of credentials that make this not grimy, that make this sort of intellectual on some level. I think it's still kept a bit of that, but it's still seen as sort of a high watermark for its cast for sure, but also for Fincher and his style. I think it might be the gateway film for a lot of people for their knowledge of David Fincher. And I think that's the kind of reputation it has. They may or may not know Alien 3. But this one is definitely, I think, the kind of film that gets people into thinking about, I like Fincher's visual style, and they associate it with him. It's not just him, but they associate it with his style because, of course, Fight Club is the next big kind of stylistic one he comes out in 1999 with.
Do you know what? That's interesting, because I think, given now what Fincher has done subsequently over the past 30 years, I think it might be the Social Network or Fight Club that people get into, and Seven becomes a discovery down the line.
Oh,
and
maybe
almost
that's just my age then. Maybe I'm thinking of it more, the fact that, because that was definitely my gateway into Fincher was Seven.
I think my gateway was Fight Club, and then I discovered Seven after that. And I think I only connected that it was the same director once I fully embraced my film bro era when I was a teenager.
Right.
But what I find really interesting about it as a David Fincher movie is that it is a skeleton key in a way for all the other films that he would make. And especially the way that he would then revisit the serial killer genre with Zodiac later on.
Yes.
And I wonder, you mentioned Alien 3, but where does Seven exist in the career of David Fincher?
Oh, it's I think the moment when he really seizes control in Hollywood. I mean, in a good way, in the sense that his style is seen as this is the new generation. I mean, very much he's a contemporary of Soderbergh and other people like that in different genres. But I think that Fincher was working all the way through the 80s. He's very known for as an MTV director, for instance. He directed a few Madonna videos. He actually worked on Star Wars, if you can believe that, on Return of the Jedi. So
did he?
He did, yes.
What did he do in Star Wars?
I think he was second unit director. I'd have to have a look back. But he worked on that as a young fella, you know what I mean? So it's an interesting beginning into his career. But the fact that he's making his own fingerprints become visible, I guess. The fact that it's style, but it's also controlled, it's measured, it's very masculine. These are all things that I think we associate with kind of Fincher's visual style. And I think that, again, as you say, it is a skeleton key. I think once you start to figure out or identify your emotions around this film and the way it presents certain visual echoes, you start to see those things repeated again and again throughout his career. I think the most different film for him is probably Social Network, actually, in my own mind. It's even though again you see certain beats and formulae within that, it's the one that stands out to me as the least Fincher in some respects, whereas Seven to me is the most sort of concentrated, dark-hearted version of Fincher that I can imagine.
And it is probably also Fincher in a way at his angriest or at his most nihilistic, especially considering the terrible experience that he had with Alien 3, which he's sort of mythologized in his own way. He'll often in interviews bring up that he would have rather died than go back to directing a movie again after the experience he had with Alien 3, that he wouldn't take his name off of it. Kind of, this is core Fincher lore at this point. But thinking about the breadth of his work, and I will be covering Zodiac later on in this series, obviously, I think he's very interested in puzzles. And in all of his films, even in the most off-kilter ones like Benjamin Button or The Social Network or even Mank, there's always at the core trying to figure out what makes someone tick. And that fits perfectly well with the framework of the serial killer narrative, like you were mentioning before. The idea of a puzzle, of profiling someone, of trying to predict their next move. And as I was talking about in earlier episodes with the Hannibal Lecter movies and the Hannibal TV show, trying to understand the design of the serial killer so you can then find the person who is behind the design, of recreating their fantasies so you can then predict their next move. And this is very much...
And to keep yourself safe from them as well.
Yes, totally. And this is very much concerned with the puzzle of John Doe's murders. So how does that unfold throughout the film? How does it set us up in the puzzle, and how does it guide us to the reveal of who the killer is?
Okay, so I think it's a two-part answer, really, isn't it? I mean, I think that in one sense you've got the structural issue of, the pleasure of the film itself, the 7 deadly sins, the 7 days. So we feel that there's sort of a sense of order going on there. And that gives us, a false control in the sense that we're thinking, I can identify who the killer is, or they will eventually figure out who the killer is, because they are trying to pathologize him, psychologically analyze him, and Morgan Freeman's character William Somerset constantly says, don't dismiss him as crazy, there's a formula, there's a plot to all this. So that's also speaking to us to say there is a narrative logic here, we are actually going to get to this payoff that you're looking for. All of this is to say that it very much conforms to the idea of the puzzle film, because the puzzle film sets out that question in whatever form it takes in order for us to solve along with the murders, or if we don't solve along, we try and predict which one's coming next, or how are they going to find the clue that brings them to the next body, that kind of thing. That, the film unfolds that way. But the other thing as well that's kind of really at the heart of it and becomes the kind of big sort of centerpiece of the last sort of 10 minutes of the film, 15 minutes of the film, is that we are all guilty of the very sins which John Doe then picks out particular examples of and uses them as the sort of centerpieces of his statement. So we all had either feelings, emotions, or acted upon versions of the 7 deadly sins. So we are all potentially guilty. We're all potential victims. And that's what makes it quite frightening as well, because we like to think that serial killers, whether you read about them for fun or you watch films, that, this killer kills women with a certain hair type or color. He kills people who are in a certain position or place in society, or are walking the street, or are looking for people in particular communities. That is, so that you immediately can then say, well, that's not me. And then you can render and feel safe within the narrative. This film doesn't allow you to do that, because, whether it's gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, etc., we've all committed some form of these sins. That's the whole point. So we're all potentially guilty, and we're all potentially victims. And I think that's what makes it quite frightening, because these are just examples. I mean, this is the whole centerpiece of Doe's big discussion at the end of the film with Mills and Somerset in the car. So I think that's what the film is trying to do. It's trying to say that you feel there's a level of control. It's contained within a box, forgive the pun, but it's also not. That's an illusion. This is something that is in no way contained. It's all over the world. It's already like a Pandora's box. It's opened everywhere.
I want to talk a little bit about Somerset and Mills, because we'll get into John Doe and his big nihilistic, rageful ideas about the world and who deserves to be punished and why he's the one chosen to dole out that punishment. And I love this idea of kind of implicating the audience that you were talking about. But before we get into that, before all of that is unfolded for us, and it takes a long time in the runtime of the film, we get the two detectives. So we get Detective Somerset and the young rookie that campaigns to be assigned to him, Detective Mills, played by Brad Pitt. So what is the relationship between them, and how do each of them approach Doe as a suspect?
So we start with Detective Somerset, who is on the last week of the job. He's about to retire. He is everything that you would expect from a detective at the end of his career. He's world weary. He's seen it all. He seeks a sense of release from the job. But at the same time, he's doing his job very methodically, very well. He's very much in the kind of mold of almost like Sherlock Holmes. He's patient. He's considerate. He's not reactionary. He's not volatile. Enter Detective Mills, who is emotional, irrational, is almost the voice of the audience, it stands in sometimes with the voice of the audience, like, why am I reading this, or why, this guy's a nutcase, or whatever it might be. He's reactionary, but he's very human, and he's very you feel that you can relate to his journey as he's trying to get in, and he believes that, the world is worth saving. He believes that there is something to fight for, and that he can make a difference. So he's very much sold on the kind of 80s cop of one guy cleaning up the streets, and that's the idealism of youth. But between the two of them, the balance between their two characters is actually what makes this film quite special, I think, because they don't bond automatically. It takes a long time for them to bond, and they bond through through Mills's wife, Tracy, when she insists that they start to bond. It's this idea as well that they both see themselves as solitary, and actually they work very well when they are brought together, even though they have opposite sides of the spectrum of character. Now, that's a very classic trope. But what's interesting is that in these kinds of stories, usually around the gifted detective who is trying to solve serial murder, that tends to be a solitary affair. That tends to be something where they have a particular insight or gift or understanding, exactly like you have with Will Graham, and they can see in the serial killer or in the murder scene what other people cannot. And what I like about this is that no one is gifted with superpowers in this. No one is gifted with secondary sight or some sort of emotional understanding or trauma that it unlocks the serial killer. It's learning and patience and paying attention. That's what they have to do. That's what Mills has to learn, and that's what Somerset imparts in his role as this sort of sage kind of detective. So what I like about it is that it splits the identity of the detectives across two characters rather than having it all in one overly complicated, damaged central character. So that's what's really clever about the film, is that it kind of splits it apart. A very common thing within 90s culture. There's a lot of doubling going on in 90s culture anyway. Very famously, Mark Evanson wrote about this, and I've written about it myself. It's this idea that, one person, as complex as they are, it's very difficult to unpick all those layers in one film or in one text. So what you do is you show a kind of a dark side and a good side, or you show a public side or a private side. And this is something that I think in the film you see darkness within both characters, but you also see hope and opportunity in this idea of actually being able to make the world a better place, however small, within both detectives as well. And they're very human. At the end of the day, they're very, very human and show vulnerability. So I think they work beautifully as a pairing, and of course the performances are absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, theirs really is a relationship, once you look at it a little bit more closely, built on binaries, both superficial and a little bit more in depth. There's the old hat detective versus the rookie. There's the black man versus the white man. There's the pessimist versus the idealist. The intellect of Somerset versus the brawn of Mills. The controlled emotions versus the impulsive one. But what I found really interesting was another scene where they bond is when Mills reaches out to his FBI contact to supply them with the library list of the people who had taken out certain select books, that dealt with Satanism and religious imagery and the 7 deadly sins and so on. So actually they bond over a very different approach to corruption too, because Mills is this idea of the violent man who chooses police force basically as a way to be legally allowed to beat people up and be violent towards people. And he's violent even in that first accidental encounter with John Doe, where he just screams at him and throws shit at him and doesn't recognize or think clearly as to why someone would get so close to a murder scene that they haven't revealed or announced to anyone. Yes. And Mills is also corrupt in a different way. He does not, he sees the utility in bending the rules for the purposes of their investigation, and kind of has to convince Mills that it's okay for them to do that in this case. Yeah. When they kick in the door, for example, after he gets really beaten up, and this idea of how much money have we got left to falsify a statement to get them legitimately there at that apartment address is one great example of it, because he's literally feeding the lines to this witness and saying, and that's when you called the police. Yeah, we're done here. So it's to falsify the trail, and in a way that's really kind of hilariously almost sort of inept. So there's the idea of actually falsification might be necessary, but actually it doesn't amount to anything in the long run. I think that is interesting because it makes the balance between them, it just again reinforces that balance between the two characters, and shows that there's a very finessed way of doing it in the case of how Somerset does it with his contact, and then there's the kind of clumsy, brawny response which wouldn't stand up in any courtroom. You know what I mean? Yeah. So, and one of the things that we've mentioned, and I think part of the cultural legacy of this film, is that we remember it as being extremely gruesome, very violent. Yeah. And then when you watch it, I almost was surprised because we see the murder scenes, and I want to talk about the design of them and the extreme baroqueness of the murder scenes of someone, but we never actually see the murder. We don't see anyone killed. It's always when they arrive at the crime scene and have to dissect it. It's all very forensic. So what do you make about the way that the Fincher displays and designs Joan Doe's murder scenes?
Well, wow. They're fantastically elaborate spaces that we enter into. Elaborate in the sense that they're designed very, very effectively. They usually are lit in a way that make you feel very nauseated. You don't necessarily see a lot in the sense that you imagine these cuts or these murders. You imagine the pound of flesh and having to choose the pound of flesh you wish to cut off your body in the case of Greed. You imagine all the violence of it, and you're told details that reinforce the tactility of that. I'm thinking particularly like we're told that Eli Gold that he sweat through his office chair, and you're thinking, how much body sweat do you have to actually go through in order for that to still be tacky, when he's discovered a couple of days later. Things like that make you go, there's little details in the descriptions that reinforce the visual, the mise-en-scène of it all, that make you feel really quite uncomfortable, and they're always quite physical. So I found that the design of that is absolutely amazing. In terms of the murders themselves, the fact that you don't see them at any point, it only opens up a narrative gap for you to imagine, and that's where it becomes really horrific. Again, and there's also a dispassionate nature to it as well. Yes. What I mean by that is the descriptions of the victims are often around their attributes, whether they're wealthy, whether they're overweight, whatever it is. It's very dispassionate by the people who find them as well.
It's very clinical.
It's very clinical, and it's almost upsetting because it's almost like they're not people. And that's something that I think it maybe needs to be divorced from this idea that, you need to be able to operate at that level where you don't look at people like people, because it would be too upsetting. But as an audience member, you're seeing them as victims, just as typologies. Again, back to that 7, back to that imagery, back to the sin in question. And that makes it very difficult, because you're seeing and being told things that are really gruesome. And at the same time, you're thinking about the dispassionate nature of solving one space to get to the next victim, whoever that might be. That's a person, so I always find that it handles it very, very well, but also shows that there's a kind of disconnection at the core of the film.
I find this disconnection to be the thing that has become more troubling the more upon my most recent viewing, and the more that I think about these films as I'm watching them all in a very compressed period of time. And what's interesting about 7, particularly in view of how true crime culture and horror culture has evolved over the last 25, 30 years since the film was released, is that there is this constant conflict, right? Particularly in true crime narratives, between we want to protect and honor the humanity of the victims, people who did not, ask to be murdered, and whose stories and violent deaths are now continuously intertwined and milked for content, while at the same time those very stories and those very narratives are more interested in the pathology and the fantasies and the traumas and the lives of the people who perpetrate the murders, so the killers. And what's interesting about 7 is, as you say, we know nothing about the victims. We barely get their names. We don't see their murder, but we see their bodies. We see their bodies displayed, mutilated, and used in some sort of grotesque performance art to make an intellectual point, and covered with clues, and all of the murders and the victims are interconnected, so he will use the chopped off fingers or hand of one victim to leave clues on another crime scene. They are putty, they're clay, they're not people. And like you mentioned it a little bit earlier, they could easily be replaced with someone else who symbolizes that particular sin. If their particular sin fits into the landscape that he's painting, that'll do. They're not at all special. They're completely replaceable. And I think both in the way that the film presents forensics is very dispassionate, very uninterested in anything related to justice. We never meet any of the victims' families. Well, we meet the wife of one of them.
Of Eli Gold. Yes, but again, she's used for one scene to identify the next clue.
And then the only other kind of connection that we meet is the man who was forced on gunpoint to kill the woman who's killed under lust with the horrible knife
appendage.
Knife strap-on thing. Anyway, we see, and there's this really terrifying close-up of him in the interrogation room just breaking down, because he is the one who's left with the knowledge of what he had to witness and do as well. And it's devastating, but we also know nothing about him. So there is this kind of aggressive, dispassionate approach that is also not super interested in the forensic element. None of the laboratory stuff that we get in Silence of the Lambs or Manhunter. It's completely interested in the design. In John Doe, not so much as a person almost, but kind of just as an artisan. And I use that word specifically because of the handmade nature of the entire film. You know, the way that we meet John Doe through, even from the title credits, which we'll discuss, you know, there's a lot of emphasis on how he's doing everything manually himself. This very exacting, precise, terribly patient figure. And at one point, Somerset says that the worst thing about him is that he's patient. So he has the time and the consistency to eke out suffering from his victims in order to design this tableau of murder that he's putting together, that he's been at this for a long time and he won't stop. So I wanted to start bringing it to John Doe because it takes us I think over an hour until we meet him. But we're obviously the film is trying to put us into his mind and his own rationale or design for his action. So how do we meet John Doe through his things?
So when we initially encounter him, he shoots at the detectives who are at his door.
Yes.
And what I love about this meeting is that it's done like a film noir. I mean, this is a neo-noir film, of course, but it is done like a film noir. He is the man in the hat and the trilby with no face. So when we because of the way he's lit, so there's this pursuit of him, and we see him as it was interesting because when we get the reveal of who he is, it reminded me of, there's a dialogue here almost with The Usual Suspects. In terms of the kind of, you know, the Kaiser Soze. Yeah, the Kaiser Soze. I kept on thinking of, he's like Kaiser Soze, you know, he's the devil himself, in the sense that he's almost physically incredibly, fit, but also incredibly capable of outrunning and outwitting a cop. You know, he's intellectual as well as brawny as well. So there is this kind of interesting kind of boiling down of different genre templates going on. But when we meet Doe and we get into his apartment, before we actually meet him on his own terms, because he enters the frame later on his own terms, which then disrupts this sense of our detectives are in control of the narrative at any point. But when we go into his apartment, that's where we really get a sense of who he is. A bit like, you know, how we discover the serial killer's mind is usually in their own space. We look at these notebooks that are filled with methodical ramblings about the world, but beautifully written, hand-stitched. You know, we see objects like the neon cross, which always kind of creeps me out whenever I see it in the film. It's like, oh God, how do you sleep in that room with the big neon red cross? But this idea of it almost like something like a cell as well. You know, it's got that kind of monastic cell kind of look to it, with the kind of the plain bed and the cross above it. But it's kind of corrupted. The images that we kind of think of as Catholic are corrupted in some ways. We get this sense that, you know, the house is the apartment, which seems way too big, by the way. I always thought that the violation of space was interesting. It's like it's way too big for that building size, you know, it's like a TARDIS, you know, keeps opening and opening. There's loads of crevices to it, but that makes complete sense to me because it's kind of like the basement in Silence of the Lambs. It just keeps going and going because you're entering the labyrinth of the mind. So all of these things are going on. The idea of the telephone being buried under clothing, I always thought was quite interesting as well. The outside world is of no interest. It's only of use in this one moment, and they have to go searching for it. So he's preaching to the world, but he's not listening to the world. So I thought all these kind of things working it through the space shows that you'll never fully know it, you'll never understand it, and in a way, even if you do know the answer, what does that tell you about this person? Nothing really. It tells you that there's a creed. That's about it. There's a creed at the core of it, but he's patient, he's intellectual, but he's also not to be understood. It's a one-way form of communication. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and what's really interesting as well is that it's not just a one-way form of communication, it's also an echo chamber that he's designed for himself.
Oh,
So
yeah,
he
very
is
much so.
completely surrounded by his own spiel. He will write in these 2,000 little notebooks, all identical in teeny tiny writing, 3 lines per allotted line. He will create these like horrific sketchbooks, plan out meticulously all these crimes, but he is just preaching to himself. He has no
Yes.
audience. And so he's almost like torturing himself with his own sermons. And what I find really interesting as well is that the whole design of John Doe, both in the way that he is revealed to us in the film, and we'll talk about that scene in particular in a minute, but by the fact that Kevin Spacey was not included in the opening credits, so
Yes.
his name only appears in the final credits,
Yeah.
the fact that he meticulously cuts off his own fingerprints so that he won't be identifiable. We never know his actual name. He's only known to us as John Doe. So he chooses these both physical and systematized way of erasing his identity.
Himself. Yes, absolutely.
We don't know who he is. We don't know his upbringing. We don't know his trauma, his fantasy,
No.
his background. And that kind of goes against what those serial killer movies, particularly in the 90s, but even
Absolutely.
subsequently, have always given us. As the detectives, be that the FBI profilers or your Jack Crawfords and Clarice Starlings or your Will Grahams, or more on the ground detectives like Mills and Somerset, more brawny kind of figures that are the layer closest to the ground, closest to the city and the murders themselves, rather than in some high tower in Quantico. They're trying to understand who is it, what is the mind, what formed that mind that committed those murders. And here there's none of that. It is simply inaccessible to us. It's completely erased by the killer himself, but also by the script, because the script could have, guided us to John Doe's mother or something. But it's uninterested in that. It's only uninterested in that echo chamber that he has designed for himself. And when he chooses to reveal those thoughts and those ideas to the world, he does it in this horrific rococo way. And even in the way that he reveals himself, because you mentioned that the first time we see him is when he bumps into Mills and kind of toys with them in that way. And that's also a trope of the serial killer narrative, of them kind of showing themselves just to come closer to detectives and know for a fact that they won't be seen, even if they get that close.
But also returning to the scene of a crime as well. It's
Yes.
also playing on that idea as well of, while this isn't a crime scene per se, there is this interesting, it's playing on that knowledge of, the first thing they say in a lot of these Harris adaptations is photograph the rope line. If someone,
Totally.
because your killer will be there for the kind of frisson of the discovery. So, so there is this playing, the more literate you are in detective fiction and these and serial killer cinema, the more this film is also toying with you, which I think is really clever. And the more you watch it, the more you realize you're being slightly wrong-footed on nuance, which I think makes the script very, very strong. But you're right in the sense that there's an echo chamber that it is the visual, of course, the inside of his mind visually expressed. But I think as well as that he's sermoning, he's preaching, he's writing these sermons essentially, or these diatribes. But it's not, the way that he can get it heard is through the visual destruction of anonymous other people.
Yes.
Rather than it to be said on the street. But what I think is interesting is that he too is anonymous. Literally, he's physically erasing himself out of the systems that we use to recognize people. But I think that, and then he even says it himself when he's talking to the detectives, that he's like, who I am is unimportant. And that's the end of it. I mean, there's nothing about him that is in any way exceptional. He says that, but it's the example he's setting. It's the puzzle that he wants that to be the work of art, the thing that's going to be studied forever, as he says.
Yeah, and he says it, what I've done is going to be puzzled over, studied, and followed. And I think that followed is the most chilling thing about Seven. But let's talk about the way that, you mentioned it before, the way that he reveals himself on his terms.
Yes.
Because he comes into the the detective station, covered in blood, with his fingertips bandaged and razored off, and he has to scream for attention
Yes.
to get noticed, and he has to say who he is before they even turn around. So how does this disrupt the narrative of the serial killer movie?
Okay, in many ways, because usually we were waiting for a serial killer to either trip up, or in the case of other films like Silence of the Lambs, where they actually kill in the community in which they begin their work. So, there is this is how it's usually kind of picked apart. They've done something somewhere along the line that will inevitably lead to their doorstep or close to it. This is not the case in Seven. I firmly believe if he hadn't inserted himself into the narrative at that point, they would never have caught him. I firmly believe that, because it's so big and random and urban and sprawling that you would never have necessarily understood who he was. But what I love about the shot when I was rewatching it, when he comes into frame, they're walking into the precinct, then this cab pulls out in front of us, and then he steps out of the cab, and the way he's dressed looks a little bit like people you'd encounter sometimes on the street who want to talk to you about their religious, their
he looks like
awakening.
a Mormon. He looks like a Mormon.
He looks like a Mormon. So he's got that very deliberate dress of white top, black trousers. It looks very plain, but also I think every man, but at the same time a religious conversion. Definitely, it's channeling that. But when he walks into the precinct, he's very soft spoken with the detective, and then he roars, and that's when the whole precinct turns around to look at him, and then they go, oh my God, stand away from him, kind of thing. So he's literally reinserted himself into the story to sort of say, you're not getting the point of this. You have to get your attention to come back to the preaching I'm trying to do, rather than getting, overwhelmed by all of the detail, because we're overwhelmed, we're assaulted with detail all the time with every murder, to the point where we feel we're going to see 7 different murders. But actually at some point we have to still go back to the pursuit of who he is, and the disruption that he has, and the power that he has over the two of them as well. And that's where I think this works really nicely, is you don't expect him to do that explicitly. You expect him to be pursued, but not actually turn the game entirely on its head by involving them and bringing them into the narrative. So I think that's where, again, this film deliberately wrong-foots someone who's never seen it. They will deliberately wrong-foots you at that point. So they don't take him seriously. I think Somerset does. Somerset knows that he's a very, very dangerous creature, but I think that this idea of him doing that shows how serious he is. His own freedom doesn't matter at this point. The preaching is more important.
Absolutely. And also, I think the way that Mills and Somerset react to him when he finally reveals himself kind of continues the brilliant characterization of the both of them, because Somerset again wants to understand, because he knows that by understanding they might unlock future victims or other people that he has in captivity, or whatever it is, whatever other plans that he might have set in motion. Like you said, he recognizes him as a dangerous creature who completely believes his own shit. And there's nothing as scary as a true believer in whatever that might be, be that any particular kind of religion or like Taylor Swift. There's anyone who is completely devoted is dangerous, because they will do anything to continue supporting that belief system. But Mills has the same kind of disparaging reaction. There's a line where he says that, just because he has a library card doesn't make him fucking Yoda or something.
Yes,
he's like anti-intellectualism runs incredibly tensely, even after he's met him, and he continuously disparages him. He insults him. He calls him like movie of the week, like fucking t-shirt at most. He sees him just as another boogeyman, not as someone who both has the means, which is very scary, the patience, which is even scarier, and the blind faith in his own right to do the things that he's doing. Yeah. So what do you think of the way that those conversations with the detectives, particularly as the film gears up to its final moments, how do those dynamics play out?
I think that, the anti-intellectualism is, again, that kind of, it's that reactionary emotional part that we were talking about before. This idea that, you know, there's no point in understanding these people. They just need to be locked up or executed, whatever it is. So it's a very black and white worldview. And actually, that's exactly why I think Somerset being so calm in those moments, especially as they're driving out, or when they're talking about him, when Doe is discussing things with his lawyer, and they're discussing the offer that they've been given by Doe to, you know, to be shown the final two victims, and but on Doe's terms. It's interesting, they only have one moment where the two of them completely agree, where Mills and Somerset agree, and that is that he's not finished preaching, and Mills and Somerset even says, you and I are for once in total agreement. They both get that they're dealing with something a lot larger. Their reactions to it are different. Their methods for maybe solving it or feeling that it's concluded are very different. But I think that actually this is a one touchstone moment where they go, this is not like a random crime we would see anywhere else. So Mills acknowledges the fullness of the situation now. He acknowledges the fact that even if he read, and he does read all the Cliff's notes, which is quite interesting. I think it's such a nice kind of little kind of shortcut way into getting some knowledge about this material that I'm in no way going to sit down and read. You can tell he has no interest in this, but it's interesting that the two of them realize that there is an unending way of kind of following him into the labyrinth, but at the same time, they need him to reveal the next bodies. There's no way that they can actually predict this. It's like what we're talking about in the when they go into John Doe's apartment. There's knowledge and sermonizing and words everywhere, but it doesn't tell us anything. Does that make sense? It's absolutely. There's an abundance of information, but there's no truth.
There's a trope in courtroom dramas, which is a type of very formulaic kind of thriller that I love going to just to relax.
I love a courtroom thriller.
Oh no, me too. But there's a consistent kind of trope there where they try to bury someone in information, try to bury someone in paper. You know, they send them all the material, everything they could possibly want, but it's trying to find a needle in a haystack. The haystack is simply too big.
Yeah. Exactly. And this is the same thing. I mean, this is what Somerset says, doesn't he? He says that, you know, if I had 50 detectives reading 24 hours around the clock, I still wouldn't have an answer. And it's like, that's the point. Yes, it is absolutely that plethora of evidence. But I also think that this evidence doesn't tell you anything. I think that it's just telling you, it's giving you a mindset. It's giving you an idea into the true believer status. It's giving you a sense of this person has erased themselves within their teachings or within their preaching. But the same thing is also true when they're looking at they have all these out. I mean, even the lust victim who survives and after having murdered someone else, they can hardly, again, they're talking, but they can't articulate. Does that make sense? They're saying things, but and they're showing their trauma, but it's not detail. It's not about the person. He just keeps on talking about what was done to him in that moment, rather than necessarily saying this guy was whatever height, whatever race, whatever, you know. It's what I'm trying to say is there's a lot of verbalization but not information, and this is why they know they have to now play with Doe's game of actually finding the next two victims, because you could get lost in the sea of evidence or in the sea of words but not necessarily find your way out of it. It's a perfect labyrinth in that sense.
And this feels like a good moment to talk about what is John Doe trying to do or trying to say? What is his grand plan?
Yeah, what is his grand plan? I mean, you can say, yes, okay, this idea of revealing that we're not living by a particular creed or living by particular standards, or that we've let morality slip, or that the contemporary society has completely slipped away in the face of the death of God, you could argue, since, you know, it's been talked about since the 60s. I think that the fact is that he's trying to, in a truly hellish way, trying to show that there are consequences for actions. But again, even coming out of this after watching it many, many times, I don't see how, in a world that is so grim from the beginning of the film, how these murders stand apart in any particular way where someone would stand back and go, wow, the 7 deadly sins as murders. Because we get the world coloured in, the urban space is coloured in for us at various times, where there was somebody stabbed down the road last night walking their dog, and you're told these really gruesome things as asides, and you're thinking to yourself, dear God, in a world where that is happening, the 7 deadly murders wouldn't necessarily stand apart unless you were investigating them, because they're not being reported on. We're not seeing reportage on the murders, except for the lawyer, because he's wealthy. We don't get any sense of someone piecing it together or it having any ripple effect in the outside world.
That's so interesting,
Yeah.
because that in itself becomes the confirmation of, and I want to preface this by saying, one of the things that I think is really smart and often misinterpreted and twisted around about Seven, but also a lot of Fincher films, particularly Fight Club, is that the films are not promoting the world or endorsing the worldview of disturbed or nihilistic characters that they portray very well, both stylistically and in terms of performance. And I'm not going to be sitting here in the year 2024 giving any credence to confirmed terrible person Kevin Spacey, so I'm going to avoid talking about him altogether. But what I do find really interesting about the point you're making is that the film is giving so much platforming to this John Doe and his utterly bullshit theory, his grand unified theory of how the world has gone to shit, and he himself, through the brutality of his actions, needs to remind people that they need to abide by certain moral codes and rules and need to not be so apathetic. Right, because apathy is a constant thing that comes over and over again from the very beginning. From even the way that Somerset is despondent about his job and the amount of difference he's been able to make. He's despondent about bringing a child into the world, and when in his conversation with Tracy, who is pregnant, and tells him that she's pregnant and unsure of having a baby in this unnamed, terrible, grim city that they're living in. That is a constant through line, from the very small human moments to the grotesque murders. But you're right, it does not have a ripple effect. Somerset takes him seriously because he does want to solve the puzzle, and he knows that he is the key for that. But he is presented to us consistently as pathetic, and has his worldview, his whole shtick of wanting to be, of leaving behind this legacy of art that will change the world, or change at least the city, the inhabitants of the city, will have no such impact.
No, not at all.
It will be gone as soon as he is gone.
Exactly, and that's the irony of what we were talking about before, when he says, what I've done will be puzzled over and studied and followed, and you're like, it won't be followed. That's the thing I always pick up from that line, is it might be puzzled over, which it has been, it might be studied, which it has been, but followed, I doubt it. In a world where this grimness pervades in every sense, even when we get daylight that finally comes in at the end after so much rain for so many days in the film, the daylight doesn't reveal anything. Does that make sense? Yeah. So we feel this sense of being completely clouded over or even crushed under in this kind of urban sprawling space that just continuously rains. And then we get out to the sunshine, and the sunshine again doesn't reveal anything. So this sense of, now that you've seen my sermon, and it's like, yeah, but no one's listening except the police, and B, it has no impact other than on the people who have been trying to solve the puzzle. So it becomes a larger echo chamber. Do you know what I mean? Yeah,
and I think that comes into play as well with the way that we then venerate and memorialize and mythologize the figure of the serial killer, particularly in the true crime space, but especially in the fictionalized true crime space. Yes. Like if I see another goddamn miniseries about one of the 3 American serial killers that everybody keeps talking about over and over again, that is the thing that releases them from their echo chamber and lets them become these celebrities, even after death. That's how we memorialize them. And I love that in Seven, actually, he's not allowed that. And the film reinforces the idea that once his crimes are cleaned up and solved, he's just going to be put in a box. He's going to be, he's going to be put in a box, stored away in a filing system somewhere in the city's library or the police department. And I want to talk a little bit about because you mentioned it, and it's one of the things that I think I internalized as part of the mood of the film, but very actively noticed how important and grimy and grim and perpetually rainy the city that they live in, and also how the city doesn't really get a name. You know, we were
Yes.
before we started
Yeah.
recording, I had put in my notes that it was obviously New York, and you said to me, well, that's obviously LA. And I found that both those readings quite interesting. So what do you think of the way that the urban space, that the city is presented in Seven?
So just beforehand, I want to just confirm you're absolutely right about the previous thing you were saying as well, about the idea of the anonymity and the blandness and him being put in a box at the end, because like anybody else, like the victims, because even again, Somerset says in the film that, you know, we hang on to these clues and these small little forensic reports in the hope that someday, somehow, justice will be served. So even the compiling of evidence is in and of itself a closed box that is filed away, very much like, you know, the warehouse at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. This idea of it just being contained in case. So these things don't get broadcast. It's not permitted into the outside world. It does not permeate through. So then when we get to the cityscape, what I love about it, I mean, to me, it always feels like a noir, and that kind of usually defaults to Los Angeles. But it is nameless for a reason, because it could be anywhere. This sense of the architecture is not necessarily particularly indicative of any particular city. You don't get the cityscape shots the way you do of New York, usually places like that, or even Chicago. So it does have that sense of ground level grimness from the beginning. We're in the mud, we're in the dirt, and we're going to these fairly bland and uninteresting places where these victims are found. So I found that the sense of being constantly on the ground is a particular kind of camera height that is consistently reinforced in the film, to show you that you are on the ground. You are in the muck, you're in the blood and the dirt all the way through the film. You don't get to escape that. And that very much makes me feel, again, that it's reinforcing those noir kind of characteristics. And that the heightened puzzles, like so many great noirs, the heightened puzzles and clues are all really MacGuffins. It's all about the awfulness of it is in the everyday surroundings. And this is what Tracy really is useful for in the narrative. She's not in it that much in the film, but she does talk about, she sees the horror of the city immediately, even when she's talking about it in their first meeting when they get together. She talks about the horror of the city, and she doesn't comment when, you know, how are you finding it? She sees the grimness everywhere. So while our two detectives are trying to put order in a world that rejects it, she sees it actually as already something that is perhaps beyond redemption. So the city stands in for the kind of the Sodom and Gomorrah of all of it. But I feel that LA works really well on this front, because when you get then to that sort of desert space outside the city, that's when you really get the sense of the depletion of the land, but you also get the kind of baking sun that kind of kills everything around it. But it also isolates, there's nobody there. So the sense of the preaching doesn't work. There's nowhere left to preach. But also this idea of the sun doesn't reveal anything. That's something I think is so important at the end. Even when you get sunlight in, kind of like daylight horror, which a lot of us have talked about before. Daylight horror doesn't necessarily reveal anything new. It's just, it's there to show you that whether it happens at night or daytime, it's there. It's a consistent
It's not
thing.
going to save you.
No, definitely not.
And
in this film, that shows you very much the case. It's the case.
And the final moment, the final couple of scenes in the desert, in this trifecta of John Doe and Mills and Somerset, and the reveal of the final two victims, which are actually Tracy and John Doe himself. Yes. I feel like that's, out of everything about Seven, the two things that I feel have had a more lasting impact and have infiltrated pop culture most intensely have been the title credit sequence. Yeah. And particularly that final scene, the what's in the box of it all. How do you feel that plays out? How do you think, like, do you find that it sort of effectively concludes all the John Doe diatribes and his murder visions, but also the characters and the partnership between Mills and Somerset?
I think it works really well on so many levels, actually. I mean, one thing that really struck me again on rewatch is that when we get into the field, when we get into the space where they're surrounded by pylons, so the helicopters have to stay away. When you look at it again, it looks like a spider's web. which is so beautifully put together. It's an establishing shot when they're coming into it, but it looks like a spider's web, all the interconnected lines and pylons. And when you look up, there's so many, when they're looking up in the shot, there's always a pylon behind nearly everybody to show you that every thread, every web, everyone's kind of caught in it. There's no way of escaping it. There's no clear blue sky behind them. So I thought that was quite brilliantly done. It's replication in Enemy as well. You see that in the film Enemy. So I think that it's showing you that, as you know, in this space, it is actually the master plan has come to pass. They've all been kind of brought into this web. The separation of the two detectives, again, quite interesting. We know that when they're separate, bad things happen. And then the fact that, as I say, when we get Somerset opening the box, and I'm really glad it doesn't show us. It doesn't show us the murder of anybody, but I'm so grateful they didn't go for the low blow and show us anything. I think I remember in the 90s when I watched it the first time, I thought I saw a strand of hair. I went back and checked. There's not even a strand of hair. I'd obviously imagined that. So
it's so infinitely more effective. I think I too thought that I saw a strand of hair being shot, being revealed kind of in a very small way, but there isn't anything. But the fact that it became such a powerful, that it became memified also by online culture is just a testament of how powerful it is to just leave things up to the imagination, particularly when you've already had so much gruesome murder displayed and so many bodies displayed in terrible ways. And I think part of it has to do with the fact that we know who Tracy is. We meet her. We understand her fears. We understand her relationship with Mills. We have a history with her. And I think if we had seen her head in that box, it would have sort of upended the whole design of the movie, where the victims actually don't matter that much. The victims are just stand-ins for the structure, the performance that John Doe is creating.
Exactly. I mean, it's crucial that we don't see at any point. And that's what I think I'm glad that they didn't lean into any kind of spectacularity. That was very controlled. I thought that was exactly the point. The fact that Tracy is virtue as well, she represents virtue in the film. You can see that the death of hope comes very much in that image of the box. The idea, of course, of that it is in itself a black box. What is in it can never be known safely. I think that there's something quite powerful about that. I also wonder as well the fact that she is a cipher to instigate Doe's murder by Mills. I also think as well, and it's come back to me now, how Doe gives himself the most cowardly murder as well. He doesn't suffer for a moment. You know what I mean? All the other victims have suffered physically or emotionally or psychologically in horrible, horrible ways. He just gets shot in the head. And I mean, you're like, you're a coward is the first thing that comes to mind. It's like, you don't suffer the way other victims suffer, and you are eulogizing your own mythology in this. So I think there's something quite interesting in that, and I only kind of realize now just how scummy that is, in the sense that his death has always felt very sort of underplayed, in the sense that it's just about getting killed because it's another body that's needed for the 7 to make it the 7.
Yeah, totally. And, I think all serial killers are cowards, except Hannibal Lecter, who's the only one who has the guts to stand up to his own vision of the world.
Well, he self-mutilates. I'll give him that. He self-mutilates, so, most of them don't do that. So.
And like I mentioned earlier, the other element of 7 that I feel has had the most lasting impact is the title credits, designed by Kyle Cooper. What do you make of them, and where do you feel their fingerprints?
So I adore these opening credits. They are so powerful. And I mean, talk about an induction. It also inducts you into the world of Nine Inch Nails if you weren't already there. I mean, with the remix of Closer, which was a huge, huge hit in 1994 on the Downward Spiral. So it brings you into this soundscape of Trent Reznor and the band, and that gives you that it gives you this beautiful texture of griminess and industrial noise, and at the same time it's warped and it's weird and made strange, and that beautifully mirrors the images we see in front of us. So the images of things like the writing into the notebooks, the slicing of the fingertips, the assemblage of the book. And I think that is assembling. It's a really good clue, because in a way it's trying to put order on chaos, and at the same time it's meaningless. And I think that's why it works really, really well. I mean, this whole film is about the tension between order and chaos, and the perceptions of order that we have in the world, that we try and bring into the world. But actually, that there's chaos there in all of its good and all of its bad. And that's what I think the opening images do. They kind of assemble this mind of a killer.
Yeah.
But it is incomprehensible until we kind of get into the film itself. But I think that it also feeds into those tropes of, if I'm a crazy person, or if I'm a person who's going to commit lots of really methodical murders, I'm going to keep a huge big notebook about it.
Oh,
I
well,
don't know.
I have so many thoughts on that.
I love that trope. You know what I mean?
It's like one of my favorite serial killer tropes. It's I think it stems from like Harriet the Spy. You know, you want to
really?
keep your little burn book where you're writing
Sure.
down how much you hate everyone else and how everyone's a big
Exhibit A,
meanie
Your
except
Honor.
you. Yeah.
You know, I mean,
But
or if you're a detective, you have your red thread, of course. I hope.
Totally.
I hope in this series you have your whiteboard and your red thread. So, you know,
in my
this is-
case, and I'm looking at my own serial killer wall right now, it's these very bougie transparent post-its that I've discovered.
okay.
So they're completely covering my wall with different things that I need to do and a little excerpts
That's
of
a very
sentences.
21st century response to that. I
No.
like that. That's
It's-
good.
it's like
I dream of the red thread. I want that all over my office.
It's like
to
a
be honest,
clean
yeah.
girl version of the serial killer notebook trope. Know what I mean?
Yep.
But there's also a thing I want to talk about the title credits, because you mentioned that they're kind of this incomprehensible thing, but I love the fact that out of the entire film, and I've rewatched them just before we logged on to record this,
okay.
again, just to see them in isolation, because they're the one portion of the film that we get from Doe's point of view.
True.
There is a kind of a recurrent thing in serial killer films, particularly in this 90s and early 2000s sort of psychological thriller / serial killer horror films, where we see things from their point of view. We get a little bit glimpse of how they view the world, right?
Yes.
But most of Seven, all of Seven, is the detectives trying to piece him together.
Yes.
And everything is relayed to us in this very orderly, controlled fashion by Doe. The credits, which weren't, even made by Fincher, they were obviously, directed by him, but they were created by Kyle Cooper, who then, went on to make a whole, the title credits for a myriad of other films, and has become one of the most influential kind of title designers in the history of movie making, and has then kind of, that style has been borrowed for everything from Taking Lives to American Horror Story.
Yes.
And American Horror Story was also done by Kyle Cooper, so he's kind of recycling his own work a little bit there. But it reminds me a bit of, and this is a weird connection, but of Ginger Snaps.
Oh, okay.
There's one scene in the title credits as well, which is a series of Polaroids and pictures that the two Fitzgerald sisters take of themselves kind of in these death scenarios. And it's the one moment where we get something that's done by them, by their hand. So it's completely their vision of the world that is all a little bit gothy and very distressed and very angry, and teenage girl angry particularly. And I find that these credits as well are, even though they don't feature anything from the actual film that we're about to see, they're also the one vision that we have from Doe's point of view. And that was kind of the creative approach to them. I've read subsequently in Cooper's interviews. And it feels disjointed and incomprehensible, but also very tactile, very artisanal again, because it's the only thing that actually lets us glimpse it, because everything else is from the outside, and everything else kind of mocks his completely pointless sadistic exercise.
I agree, and I'm going to do one better for you and say that that completely hooks back into the Hollywood Gothic movement, because the Hollywood Gothic movement was about foregrounding subjectivity of monsters, whether it's vampires or Frankenstein's creature, or so it's very much of that time in the 90s where it's like we want to get the point of view that's always been either misunderstood or elided over in some capacity. And I mean, Hannibal Lecter gives us a touch of that, of course, but he's still unknowable, really, I suppose, in Lambs, but we still get that sense of insight, but and we get the kind of the depth or the story from his point of view much later on in Hannibal and the film and the novel. So my point is that in the 90s you get this, it's happening already in other forms of fiction and other forms of horror, but you get this deep dive into how do they see the world. I'm thinking of Cell, another film that does that with beautiful kind of production design at its core as well. That really gives you that sense of trying to enter the nightmarish mind of the killer. But because John Doe is not supernatural, because he is not in any way gifted with any kind of secondary kind of source of power, it's interesting that it's almost when he's putting together the book, and I'm thinking of the stitching images in particular, it always makes me think of, does he feel he's just a receiver for God or whatever he thinks God is, because he's stitching it together as though he were some sort of kind of receiver for this information, but he doesn't even understand it himself. The incomprehensibility of it is that the images don't seem to, we look at the books and stuff very fleetingly and we see images that don't seem to fit. They don't seem to, it's like a scrapbook, but a scrapbook of the mind that we don't know how those pieces fit together, even though the handwriting is incredibly, very legible, very, very clean, but it's clean to the point of lacking personality again, So there's, every time we think we can know something, it just leads us to an emptiness or a dead end. That's what I think is fascinating about it.
And it's also kind of goes back to this to this visual nature of him as a killer as well. And he's a photographer. He's got a dark room. He takes pictures of Mills and of other people. He takes pictures of his victims as well. Yes. There is this almost, and I'm completely taking away any positive connotations of this word, kind of artistry to the way that he approaches things, because it is all very scrapbooky. It's very DIY. It's very, I'm going to have a little box for the Polaroids that I take it well. Very much so. But it's
very curated.
It's curated in an incomprehensible way. And even, when you talk about his apartment that doesn't make sense in terms of layout and has this big neon red cross over the bed, it's all for the sake of the visuals. It doesn't actually make any sense. It makes sense to him, I'm sure, but actually, and this is why the point I was making about the title credits, the film then reinforces the opposite. His vision of the world, his sermon on the mountain, doesn't actually make sense. It's not because it's so profound that nobody's smart enough to understand it. It's because it doesn't actually stick. There's nothing in there that will stick and have any sort of resonance or follow through or impact on the world. But I think there's so much that goes into the visual construction, all of these supporting materials, these sketchbooks, these grand designs, this documentation that he does of his pieces. It's very art school.
Yes. Even the murder weapons, I thought it was performance art when we're talking about the leather piece. That again tells that, is he art is used, and literature as well is used and reinforced, early modernist pieces as much as contemporary kind of use of photography and technology. But it's all done to, well, I suppose the idea of that, some of these concepts have been with us forever, but again, it doesn't permeate through, as we've been saying. This sermon doesn't land, and to whom it's being broadcast, as I said, the police or the detectives, we find it goes nowhere. I mean, again, to the point where when we have, when Mills eventually is taken away at the end of the film, they say, well, we'll take care of him. So we assume, hopefully, there's not too much of a ramification, but also as well, where are you going to be? And Somerset says, I'll be around. So nothing has changed, even to the point where Somerset continues on. So there's been no ripple effect outside of the 7 days and these murders and this sermon that has been closed or sealed off at the end. It's really interesting that it goes nowhere,
Which feels like a good note to wrap up this conversation. Before we wrap up, is there anything about Seven that you wanted to mention that we may not have covered?
Well, I suppose the thing is if you can try and seek out, Fincher had actually they cast a new print of it not so long ago with silver.
Yes,
and that's
I saw
meant
it.
to looking. Oh, did you see it?
Yeah.
I haven't seen it, but it's meant to be incredible. What can you say about it?
Well, I remember I was thinking about it when I was reading some articles about Seven. And by the way, there's a great, it's actually an extract of his book on the films of Fincher, but Adam Naiman, who's the film critic for The Ringer, he's got an excerpt about Seven over on the Ringer website. Highly recommend that. And there was a piece on the BFI website about the influences or what films Seven had drawn from. And I suddenly remembered that they screened this new print when that came out. And I remember going to see it, and I had never seen Seven on the big screen. So my first experience of Seven was in that new print with the silver that he had cast.
How did it look? Do you remember it looking any particular way, or
did
the texture feel different? Or
the texture definitely felt different. This was not entirely 10 years ago, but closer to 10 years ago than it was to 5. I think it was 2016.
Oh wow,
maybe.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And it felt a lot. I'm trying to visualize it right now, and I seem to remember that it felt a lot more brownish or / golden even.
Yeah.
Did you manage to see it?
No, I didn't. Not the silver struck one. But I remember watching it recently for this. I always remember the film had a particular color palette that made me go like it's brown into blacks and the occasional eruption of reds and Rosso's kind of colors. And I just thought, oh, that's it. You always feel a bit. It's decay rather than necessarily it's rot. It's something that's turning, and it's not like the kind of colors we see later on in the 2000s when we have like with body horror, which actually I think is more green. There's a lot of green
absolutely.
in those. But actually there's some sort of gold kind of turning into kind of decay, like the flesh decay. That's what made me think of that in the 90s. But again, the color palette of this film that is so dark and lit by flashlights and lit by arbitrary lighting that creates this mood that just absolutely pervades the film. I think that has stood up so well and is really worth reevaluating and looking through with some commentaries, because it's visually something else. I think that's why it looks so unlike a lot of other imitations that have come afterwards. Some very loving imitations, but they don't stand up to the cinematography and the design of this film, because it really is exquisitely put together.
It really is. And actually one of the interesting things is that browns, rusts, kind of blacks, and are constant of the film. Red only pops up occasionally, and mostly it's through neon lighting as opposed to blood, because again, like we mentioned before, the murder scenes they're not wet, they've already dried up. They're forensic sites as opposed to sites of blood. And the freshest murder that we get, at least we get that covered up with sheets. We don't see Gwyneth's head in the box. But it's absolutely beautiful. And one of the things that I love about that Adam Naiman piece of writing about Fincher is that he talks about Seven as an act of transfiguration, of transfiguring style into substance, because the style of it, every choice that's made stylistically, and we know that Fincher is one of the most exacting directors out there working today, is the actual substance of the film. That is the point that it's making, as opposed to whatever bullshit John Doe is spewing.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And again, kudos back to the idea of Fincher as well. He loves opening credits. It's something I really, really appreciate about him. We get, again, inside the mind of somebody when he opens again with Fight Club, which starts in a new one. So, there's these echoes across his career that I think are fascinating. So I think it would make it a really interesting double bill, if not for different reasons, but, make a very interesting double bill.
Sarika, thank you so much for your time. It's been such a pleasure revisiting this film and then also having this conversation about it with you.
Yes, it's been wonderful. Thank you, Anna, as ever.